They gave us seats at the back, behind a brass rail older than my country, and told us we were not to touch the table. I want to be precise about that, because most of what came after turned on people not being precise. We were not told we could not play. We were told we were not to touch the table. There is a difference, and on a world where words are filed and kept for 600 years, the difference is the only thing that ever matters. There were 6 of us, Dayas who could read an interface the way other people read a face, Okonkwo who had spent 20 years moving fuel and food across places that did not want either to arrive, Marsh, the youngest, who had a bad habit of reading the footnotes, Ruiz and Hale, quiet, good at the things that do not photograph well, and me, Carver. I had spent my career planning operations that other people then improved or ruined, and I had reached the age where I no longer minded which. We were an exchange cohort. That is a polite term for a courtesy. The Korath Accord had been studying humans for a little under a generation, and they had decided the most efficient way to study a thing is to seat it in the corner of a room and let it watch. So they let us watch. The Pelin War College admitted us as audited observers, which meant we could sit at the back of the Great Hall and follow the play on our own slates, and at the end someone would record that humans had been present and had not embarrassed anyone. The hall was called the Long Table, after the thing it was built around. The thing it was built around was not really a table. It was a basin of light 100 meters across, sunk into the floor, and above it hung a volume of the galaxy rendered so finely that when you leaned over the rail you felt the small animal part of your brain decide you were going to fall into it. Stars in it were not decoration. Each one was a position, a supply line, a population, a clock. The Solvani had been refining that simulation for longer than humans had been writing things down, and they had a name for what it modeled. They called it the Standing War. The Solvani themselves are worth describing, because nothing about what happened makes sense unless you understand that they are not slow. Slow is the wrong word, and it insults them. They are unhurried in the way a glacier is unhurried, which is to say they are moving the whole time and they will be moving long after you are gone. A Solvani lives perhaps 600 of our years. They are tall and narrow and pale, with a membrane along the throat and forearms that shifts color when they think, the way our faces move when we feel. They do not raise their voices because raising your voice is a thing you do when you are running out of time. They reach consensus the way water reaches the sea. To them, a decision made in an afternoon is not a decision. It is a spasm. It is the kind of thing a creature does right before it dies, and they had watched a great many short-lived creatures die, and they had drawn the obvious conclusion. Their master of the table was named Dalsarin. He had run the capstone exercise for a little over 300 years. When he stood at the rim of the basin and the light came up under him, his throat membrane went the deep settled gray of a man who has explained the same thing 10,000 times and expects to explain it 10,000 more, and is at peace with that. We had 3 weeks at the college before the capstone, and most of it I spent learning how the Solvani made up their minds, because that is the thing you have to understand about an opponent or an ally before anything else is worth knowing. They did not argue. I watched a faculty of the college decide, over the course of 4 days, whether to reroute a water line in the residential tier, and there was no debate in it that a human would have recognized as debate. They gathered. They held a standing, a posture, taken and kept, that meant a position offered for consideration, and the others regarded it, sometimes for hours, their throat membranes drifting through colors I learned to read only roughly, and slowly the standing was joined or it was not, and when enough of them had joined it the decision had simply happened, the way a temperature settles, with no vote and no moment you could point to as the moment. The whole thing took 4 days for a water line. I asked a junior once how they decided anything urgent, and the junior looked at me with what I came to understand was pity, and said that a decision made urgently was not a decision a person should have to live 600 years having made. That stayed with me. A human officer of mine had once told me that the worst decisions of his life were the ones he had time to think about, and the best were the ones he had to make before the fear could arrive. The Sulvani had built an entire civilization on the opposite premise, and they had survived longer than I could fully take in, so I did not assume they were wrong. I only filed the difference. It is the planner's whole job, filing differences, and I had not yet seen the table. They let us watch a practice cohort run a lesser scenario in our first week, a frontier skirmish meant to teach supply discipline, and that was where I first stood at the rim of the basin and looked down into the false stars and felt the difference in my body before I understood it in my head. The Sulvani cohort played beautifully and without haste. They consolidated. They held. They moved a fleet over what the table rendered as 11 days and discussed each leg of the move as it happened, calmly, and lost nothing, and earned a clean score, and at no point did any of them do anything I would have called a decision. They let the situation tell them what it wanted, and they gave it that slowly, and the situation never surprised them because they never asked it to. Diaz watched the whole thing beside me, and at the end said only, quietly, that it was the most relaxing thing he had ever seen, and he never wanted to do it. I knew what he meant. There was no edge in it anywhere. It was a war run like a long meal among people who would all still be alive in 300 years and saw no reason to rush the courses. The capstone is the last exercise a Sulvani officer plays before the college releases them into the long service of the Accord. It is the standing war. The scenario is fixed. You are given command of one of two powers contesting a frontier. They are called, in the model, the Ashik and the Vor, though the names are only labels and everyone knows they are stand-ins for older and realer things. The frontier is called the Reach. You hold the Reach. You are scored on how long you hold it before your civilization comes apart under the weight of holding it. That is the entire game. You do not win the standing war. You carry it. The best cohort in the college's recorded history had carried the line for 410 simulated years before their model society fractured, and the table called the exercise. Most cohorts broke before 200. The average graduating officer kept the Reach for somewhere under a century of simulated time and considered themselves blooded for it. I want to be fair to them because it is easy, from the outside, to make a people sound foolish. The Sulvani were not foolish. The standing war was not a failure of their imagination. It was the distilled truth of their whole experience of the universe, which was that you do not get to resolve things. You endure them. Their actual history, the real one behind the labels, was a frontier deadlock with a neighbor that had lasted, in plain fact, longer than the human species had existed. They had not lost that war. They had not won it. They had carried it, generation handing the line to generation, and they had built a civilization that could do that without flying apart, and they were rightly proud of it. The capstone was where they taught the young the only lesson that had ever kept them alive. Some things cannot be won. The grown-up response to a thing that cannot be won is to learn to carry it forever with dignity, and to teach your children to carry it after you. The council came to watch them learn it. That was the part that made the capstone more than a school exercise. Once each cycle, the high seats of the Korath Accord left the chambers where they actually governed and came down to the Pelin War College to observe the standing war played by the graduating cohort. It was the oldest unbroken tradition the Accord had. The official reason was ceremonial. The real reason, I came to understand, was that the council needed to watch it. They were governing a real frontier, a real deadlock with their own real neighbor, and the doctrine of endurance was the load-bearing wall of everything they did. Once a cycle they came to the long table to see the doctrine confirmed by the best the college could produce, and they went home with the wall reinforced, and they kept the Accord from doing anything rash for another generation. I am told there were 11 high seats present the cycle we attended. I could only ever keep track of 2 of them. The first was Senorati, a Sulvani so old her membrane had gone almost translucent, who sat very still and watched the humans more than she watched the table. The second was the only non-Sylvani on the council that I ever saw, a high seat of the Idrani named Eryx. The Idrani are a smaller, quicker species, all angles and dark eyes, and the Accord had folded them in some centuries back, and they carried themselves with the particular care of a people who know they were folded in and not founders. Eryx had a sharp manner that the Sylvani tolerated the way you tolerate a clever child, and Eryx had spent 2 months, before we arrived, formally petitioning the college to deny the human cohort even our seats at the back. I read the petition. They let me. The Accord keeps almost nothing secret because keeping things secret is a thing you do when you are afraid of time. Eryx's argument was not stupid. It ran like this. The standing war scenario is the keystone of the Accord's strategic self-understanding. Placing observers from a species we do not understand. A species, the petition noted, that resolves its own conflicts with a speed that suggests either great wisdom or a complete failure to grasp consequence, risks contaminating the cohort's performance, and worse, risks the council drawing the wrong lesson from whatever the observers do. Better, Eryx wrote, to study the humans in a controlled setting later, where their habits cannot infect the one exercise the Accord cannot afford to have infected. The college overruled the petition. Dalsarin himself overruled it, in a single line appended to the bottom of the document, in the unhurried gray of a man who had run the table for 300 years and could not conceive of anything 6 creatures from a corner could do to it. The observers may attend, he wrote. They are not to touch the table. So there we were, behind the brass rail with our slates, not touching the table. We had 10 days before the capstone. The Sylvani gave us those days as a kindness, so that the humans would understand what they were watching and not interrupt it with questions. They gave us full access to the scenario documentation. They did not give it to us as a courtesy to our intelligence. They gave it to us the way you give a guidebook to a tourist, so the tourist will be quiet and impressed in the right places. The documentation for the standing war was the length of a small library. The Sylvani had been writing it for 3 centuries. Diaz pulled it all and we split it up and started reading, because that is what you do, and on the second day Marsh found the footnote. I should explain why Marsh read footnotes. The rest of us read documents to understand what they wanted us to do. Marsh read documents to understand what they had not bothered to forbid. It is an unattractive quality in a junior officer and an extremely useful one in a planner, and I had been protecting Marsh's career from people who found it unattractive for 2 years. The footnote was in the section on victory conditions. There was a section on victory conditions. I had assumed there would not be, given that the entire premise was that the war could not be won, but the Sylvani are thorough, and the rules of the table had been written by people too honest to leave a section out just because no one would ever use it. The standing war had a win condition. It had always had one. To win, you had to drive the opposing power to what the documentation called terminal commitment, a state in which the enemy's command logic, the modeled mind running the war, had committed every reserve it possessed to the field and could no longer refuse a decisive engagement. Force terminal commitment, win the resulting engagement, and the war ended. The frontier collapsed in your favor. The reach was yours. The standing war was over. It was right there, in the rules. For 300 years. I read it 4 times. Then I had Marsh read it to me out loud, because sometimes a thing is only real when someone says it. The reason no one had ever done it was in the next footnote, and the reason was the whole story. The vor command logic, the enemy mind, would not commit its reserve until its opponent committed theirs. That was its core behavior, modeled off the real neighbor across the real frontier, and it was the most accurate thing in the entire simulation. The enemy would match you. If you held back, it held back. If you spent, it spent, but never first, never more than it had to, always answering and never opening. 2 powers, each refusing to commit until the other committed, each waiting for the other to be foolish first, and so neither ever was, and so the line stood, and so the war was eternal. The deadlock was not a flaw in the design. The deadlock was the design. It was the truth the Solvani had learned from their own frontier and had built into the model with terrible fidelity, because it was the truth that had governed their whole existence. To break it, you had to commit first. You had to be the one to spend fully before the enemy did, and you had to do it knowing the enemy would not yet have committed and so could punish you for it. You had to throw your reserve into the field and accept the catastrophe of having no reserve while the enemy still had theirs, and you had to do it on purpose, because that was the only thing that would draw the enemy's reserve out of safety to finish you. And only when the enemy's reserve was out, fully committed to finishing you, could you spring the second part and trap it. The price of forcing terminal commitment was that you had to bleed first, and you had to bleed enormously, and you had to do it in the early hours of the war, before there was any way to know it would work. The documentation modeled it plainly. To bait the Vor reserve into the open, you would have to give up the near worlds of the Reach, the closest, the most populous, the ones a commander is most desperate to defend. The model put the cost at billions. It put it at billions in the first hours of a war the doctrine said should be carried gently across centuries. You would, in the first afternoon, deliberately lose more than most cohorts lost in 400 years of careful holding. And then, if it worked, the war would be over by nightfall. I sat with that for a long time. The other 5 waited. They had learned to wait when I went quiet. "It's not that they can't win," I said finally. "It's that winning costs more right now than they're willing to pay right now, so they decided it can't be won. And they've been deciding that for 300 years. For longer than that," Marsh said. "The footnote cites the real frontier. They've been deciding it the whole time." Okonkwo, who had moved fuel and food into places that did not want either to arrive, and who therefore understood the difference between a thing being impossible and a thing being unbearable, said the only thing worth saying: "We'd pay it." I looked at him. "Would we?" "We bleed first all the time," he said. "We call it the opening move." He was right. That is the thing I keep coming back to all these years later, the thing I have never found a clean way to say. The Solvani were not weaker than us, or less brave, or less wise. They were longer. They had so much time that spending any of it fast felt like a sin, and over 600 years a being learns to carry almost anything rather than spend everything at once, because there is always more time to carry it in. We do not have that. We are short. We are over so quickly that we have built our whole way of thinking around the idea that some things have to be finished now, paid for now, ended now, because we will not be here for the long carry. A human looks at a thing that cannot be won, and a small, ugly voice asks, "But what would it cost to win it anyway?" And we are short enough that sometimes we listen to the voice. It is not a virtue. I want to be clear about that, because in the years since, people have wanted to make it a virtue, and it is not one. It is a consequence of being brief, but it is ours. I did not decide anything that night. We were observers. We were not to touch the table. What I did was the small thing, the planner's thing, the thing that is not against any rule because no one wrote a rule against it. I had the cohort spend the rest of the 10 days doing what we would have done if we were going to play, even though we were not going to play. We modeled it. On our own slates behind the brass rail in the corner, we built the opening move. We worked out exactly which near worlds to give up and in what order to make the loss read, to the Vor logic, as a genuine collapse and not a trap. We found the route. There was a route, off in a quiet corner of the Reach, that the documentation described as decorative, an old corridor between 2 dead systems that the model carried for historical reasons, and that no cohort had used in living memory, because it led nowhere worth going. It led nowhere worth going unless you needed somewhere to stand when the enemy's whole reserve came out into the open to finish you. Then it led to the only place in the Reach from which you could close the door behind that reserve, and turn the finishing blow into a trap. We had the entire thing built by the 8th day. I locked it on Diaz's slate and I did not look at it again, because we were observers, and we were not going to touch the table, and there was no point torturing 6 people with a perfect plan they would never run. Twice in those 10 days, a junior of the college came to teach us the doctrine in person, because the Solvani did not trust a document to do what a teacher could do, and I let it happen, partly out of courtesy, and partly because I wanted to hear the doctrine said aloud by someone who believed it. The junior was patient with us in the way you are patient with the very young or the very brief. The standing war, the junior explained, is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be inhabited. The error of the immature commander is to treat the line as a thing that can be made to end. The line does not end. The mature commander stops asking it to end and begins instead the long work of holding it so well, so evenly, that the holding becomes a way of life rather than an emergency. The junior said this the way a human might explain that the sun rises, with no defensiveness in it at all, because to the junior it was not a position. It was simply how the universe was shaped. I asked the junior on the second visit whether anyone had ever tried to force the enemy to commit. The win condition, I said, it's in your own documentation. The junior's membrane did a slow, troubled thing I had not seen before. Yes, the junior said, the condition is written. It is written so that the documentation is complete and honest, because an incomplete record is a kind of lie. But it is understood by everyone who reads it that the condition is theoretical. To pursue it, one would have to accept the loss of the near worlds in the opening, and no commander would do that, and so it is not done. The junior said the words no commander would do that the way a human might say no one would put their hand in a fire, not as a rule, but as a description of what a sane creature simply is. It was not forbidden. It was unthinkable, which is stronger than forbidden, because a forbidden thing has at least been thought. I did not argue. There is no profit in arguing a temperament. But I went back to the squad that night and I told them what the junior had said, the part about no commander would do that, and Okonkwo laughed once, without much in it, and said that he had spent 20 years being the commander who would do that, and that they had given him a medal for it, and then quietly never promoted him again, and that this was the most at home he had felt since he enlisted. We spent the back half of the 10 days hardening the route. The decorative corridor was the whole plan, and a plan that rests on one corridor is a plan that fails if the corridor is contested. So Ruiz and Hale ran the model again and again to be sure the Vor logic would never garrison it, and it never did, because the documentation was right that the corridor led nowhere worth going, and a mind built to never spend more than it had to would not spend anything on a road to nowhere. Its own efficiency was the lock on the door. We were going to use the enemy's discipline against it, which is the oldest move there is, and the only one that ever really works. Then, on the morning of the capstone, the graduating cohort did not arrive. I never learned the whole of why. The Solvani do not have accidents the way we do, but they have something adjacent, a slow procedural failure that compounds over decades, and that morning, a procedural failure that had been compounding for some time came due. The graduating cohort had been suspended, the night before, pending a review of an irregularity in their preparation. The Solvani are honest to the point of self-harm. The irregularity was small and would, in any human institution, have been handled with a memo. But in the accord it meant the cohort could not be certified, and a cohort that could not be certified could not play the capstone, and the capstone could not be moved, because the council was already there. 11 high seats had crossed half the accord to watch the standing war carried with dignity, and there was no one to carry it. I have thought a great deal about the next few minutes, because everything turned on them, and because they were, in the end, very quiet. Dalsarin stood at the rim of the basin with his membrane the flat gray of a man recalculating 3 centuries of certainty. He could cancel the capstone. That would be a humiliation the college had not suffered in his lifetime, performed in front of the entire council. He could run the scenario himself as a demonstration, but the master of the table does not play the capstone. It would prove nothing, and worse, it would look like the college had needed its oldest master to cover for a failure which it had. He stood there, and the light came up under him, and 11 high seats waited, and the only sound in the long table was the small electrical hum of 100 meters of light pretending to be a galaxy. And then Eric's, the Idrani high seat who had spent 2 months trying to keep us out of even our seats, said, into that silence, the single most useful thing anyone has ever done for the human species. Let the observers play. Eric's did not say it to be kind. I understood that even then. Eric's said it because Eric's had built an entire petition on the theory that humans, let near the standing war, would do something rash and instructive, and here was a chance to prove it in front of the whole council and bury our species' credibility under our own corpse for a generation. Eric's wanted us to play so that the council would watch us fail, fast and foolishly, and would carry home not a reinforced wall but a confirmed contempt. It was a trap, and it was a good one, and it was made entirely out of Eric's certainty about what we were. Dalsarin's membrane shifted through a color I had not seen on him, a kind of pale considering green. He looked at the 6 of us behind the rail. I cannot prove this, I think he saw the same trap Eric saw, and I think he reached the same conclusion by the long road, which was that letting the humans play and fail was a cleaner end to a ruined morning than canceling. Either we would prove instructive in our failure, or we would carry the line a little while and prove the doctrine sound, and either way the council would go home with what it came for. There was no version in his 300 years in which the corner of the room was a danger. The observers may play, he said. They will be scored as a cohort. They will be told the rules and given no advantage. He paused, and the gray came back, settled and final. The standing war cannot be won. It can only be carried. The college will record how long the humans carry it. He meant it as a courtesy. He was telling us in front of the council not to be ashamed when we broke, because everyone broke. The only question was the year. It was the kindest thing he knew how to say, and it was the doctrine, stated plainly, one more time, the way it had been stated to every cohort for 3 centuries. Some things cannot be won. Carry them with dignity. I came around the brass rail. The Sulvani had a protocol for everything, even this, and a junior of the college walked me down to the command position at the rim of the basin and showed me where to stand and how the table answered to a commander's hands. Diaz came down with me, and Okonkwo and Marsh, and Ruiz and Hale took the auxiliary positions, and the light of a false galaxy came up under all of us, and somewhere behind and above us, 11 high seats settled in to watch the humans carry the line. I want to tell this part the way it actually happened, which is slowly and then all at once, because that is the only honest way. The standing war begins in stillness. Both powers hold the reach. Both reserves are safe. The Vor logic sits across the frontier and waits, and the correct opening, the opening every Sulvani cohort had played for 300 years, is to wait back. You consolidate. You shore up your near worlds. You settle in for the long carry. The first simulated months of a well-played standing war are almost without event. 2 powers regarding each other across a line that neither will be the first to cross, and the score ticks up year by careful year, and the cohort earns its century of holding. We did not consolidate. The first thing I did in the first 10 minutes was give the order to evacuate nothing and reinforce nothing on the near worlds of the reach, and instead to begin moving every reserve we had toward the frontier into the open, where the Vor logic could see it. Diaz's hands moved over the table and our reserve came out of safety, all of it, deliberately, visibly, and started flowing toward the line. Above and behind me I heard the council move. Not loudly. The Sulvani do not move loudly, but 11 high seats shifting their posture at once makes a sound like a long exhalation, and I heard it, and I did not turn around. Because here is what the council was seeing. In the first 10 minutes of a war meant to be carried for centuries. They were seeing the humans do the one thing the doctrine forbade. They were seeing us commit first. We were spending our reserve into the open before the enemy had committed anything, which meant we were inviting the enemy to punish us, which meant we were, by every principle the Accord had built its survival on, throwing the war away in the opening move. To them, it must have looked exactly like Eric's had promised it would look. Rash. Instructive. The short-lived creature, unable to grasp consequence, killing itself in the first afternoon. Marsh beside me was watching the Vor logic. It's not matching, Marsh said. It's holding. It thinks we made a mistake. It thinks we're a cohort that doesn't know how to play, I said. Good, keep bleeding. We bled. I gave up the near worlds in the order we had modeled across those 10 days, the order designed to make the loss read as a real collapse, and the Vor logic, watching us hemorrhage our own people and infrastructure to no apparent purpose, did exactly what 300 years of footnotes said it would do. It did not commit its reserve. Why would it? Its opponent was destroying itself for free. The model rendered the cost as the model always had, plainly, without mercy, the count climbing in the corner of the table, the billions, the first afternoon's worth of them, and I watched the number climb and I did not look away from it, because a person who is going to spend a thing that large should at least have the decency to watch it spent. I heard Senorati, the oldest of the high seats, say something I was not meant to hear. I have it second-hand from a Solvani who was nearer to her, and I do not entirely trust the translation, but the sense of it was this. She said, watching the number climb, they will not bear it. No commander bears it. They will lose their nerve and pull back, and then it is only a defeat. She was wrong, but I understand why she said it. In 300 years she had watched every cohort that ever flirted with the win condition do exactly that. They would commit, see the price begin to come due, lose their nerve at the sight of the count, and pull their reserve back to defend what was left. And the moment they pulled back, the trap was dead, the bait was wasted, and they had simply thrown away their reserve for nothing and lost. Every Solvani who had ever started down this road had turned back when they saw the bill, because they were long, and a long creature can always find a reason to carry a thing rather than pay for it all at once. We did not turn back. I held the order. Diaz held the tempo. Okonkwo modeled the logistics of our own collapse so that it stayed legible, so that it kept looking like a route and not a plan, and the near worlds fell, and the count climbed, and I held the order, and I did not pull the reserve back, and the second hour ended with the human power apparently in the middle of the worst opening in the recorded history of the standing war. The middle of those hours was the hard part, and I have never found a clean way to teach it to anyone, because there is nothing to do in it but hold a decision you have already made while everything you can see tells you that you are wrong. The table does not let you look away from the count. It sat there over the basin, climbing, and the smart, frightened animal in the back of my skull spent the whole of the second hour explaining, very reasonably, that I could still pull the reserve back, that I could still save some fraction of the near worlds, that no one would blame a cohort of observers for losing the standing war a little more gracefully than this. The animal is always reasonable. That is what makes it dangerous. I had learned, a long time before any of this, that the only way past it is to make the decision once fully at the start while you can still think, and then refuse to reopen it, because if you let yourself reopen it in the middle, when the count is climbing and the fear has arrived, you will always close it the wrong way. So I did not reopen it. I read the count and I let it climb and I held. Behind me the council was certain we had failed. I could feel it the way you feel weather change. The shifting and the long exhalations had stopped, somewhere in the second hour, and been replaced by the particular stillness of an audience that has stopped being surprised and started being merely sad. They had seen this before, or thought they had the reckless cohort that throws everything away and then has to be watched, out of courtesy, all the way to the bottom. I heard once the dry-clipped voice of Eric saying something to the high seat beside him, and though I could not make out the words, I did not need to. The petition had been right. The humans were rash. The council was watching it confirmed. Eric's had what Eric's came for, 2 hours early, and I let Eric's have it, because a man who thinks he has already won will commit his reserve, and so will a mind built in his image. It's still holding, Marsh said, low, watching the Vor logic. It hasn't committed. We've given up everything and it still won't come out. There was no fear in Marsh's voice. There was the flat strain of a junior officer watching the bill come due and trusting, against every instinct, that the planner had read the footnote correctly. Carver, if it doesn't come out, we've just lost the worst game in 300 years for nothing. It'll come out, I said. It can't help it. It's built to finish a beaten enemy at no risk, and we've spent 2 hours being the most beaten enemy it's ever seen. The only thing it's waiting for is to be sure we're dead. I watched the count, and the line of our false collapse funneling toward a corridor that led nowhere. Let's go on being dead a little longer. And in the 3rd hour, the Vor logic committed its reserve. It committed because that is what it was built to do. It had watched its opponent throw everything into the open, and then fail to defend its own worlds and then keep failing, and it had concluded, correctly by its own logic, that its opponent had collapsed, and the moment had come to finish a beaten enemy at no risk. It brought its reserve out of safety and into the reach to end us, because the war was as good as won and there was no longer any reason to hold anything back. That was the moment. That is the whole war, right there in the 3rd hour. The enemy reserve came out of safety, all of it, fully committed to finishing a foe it believed was already dead. And for the first time in 300 years of the standing war, both reserves were in the open at once. I gave the second order. We had spent the first 2 hours making the corridor look like a retreat. The old decorative corridor between the 2 dead systems, the one the documentation carried for historical reasons, and no cohort had touched in living memory. We had been funneling the broken remnants of our reserve toward it the whole time, and to the Vor logic it read as a beaten army fleeing toward a dead end, which is what made it irresistible to pursue. The enemy reserve poured into the reach after us and committed, fully, to the pursuit, and the corridor was the only place in the entire model from which you could close the line behind a force that had overcommitted to finishing you. We closed it. I will not pretend it was elegant on the table. War games are not elegant. They are bookkeeping that occasionally screams. But the bones of it were simple, the way the best moves are always simple once someone has paid the price to set them up. The enemy reserve was in the corridor, fully committed, pursuing a retreat that was not a retreat. Our broken remnant was not broken. It had been positioned across those 10 days to be exactly here, now, with the enemy's whole strength on the wrong side of a door. We shut the door. The Vor logic, for the first time, had no reserve to refuse with, because it had committed it all to a kill that was a trap, and a mind whose entire behavior was built on never committing first had finally committed everything to second. And second, it turned out, was too late. The model recognized terminal commitment in the 4th hour. The Vor logic had no reserve left to withhold, no engagement it could decline, no way to wait us out, because waiting is a thing you do when you have something held back, and it had nothing held back. We forced the decisive engagement it could no longer refuse. We won it. We had spent everything to make sure that when this single engagement came, it would be the only thing left that mattered, and so it was, and so we won it, and the war ended. The frontier collapsed in our favor in the 5th hour. The reach was ours. The standing war, the scenario that had never been won, that was not meant to be won, that 11 high seats had crossed half the accord to watch carried gently across the centuries, was over. It had taken 5 hours. The table does a thing when an exercise resolves, where the false galaxy stills and the count of the dead and the held and the lost freezes in the air over the basin for the cohort to read. It froze. The number we had paid in the first afternoon hung there, enormous, real-looking. exactly as large as the documentation had always said it would be, and beside it hung the other number, the one no Solvani cohort had ever seen the table render, the one that said the war was won. For a while no one said anything at all. I have been in quiet rooms. After a real operation goes the way you planned, there is a silence that is not relief and is not triumph. It is just the sound of everyone privately checking the arithmetic and finding it holds. This was not that silence. This was the silence of 11 high seats and a master of the table, and a hall full of the college discovering all at once that a wall they had leaned their whole civilization against for longer than my species had been writing was not a wall. It was a door. It had always been a door. The handle had been described in a footnote for 300 years. And the only reason none of them had ever opened it was that opening it cost too much to bear all at once. And they were a people who never had to bear anything all at once because they were long. And so they had decided slowly, over centuries with great dignity, that the door did not open. It opened. It took 5 hours and a price they could not pay and would not have paid and were, I think, genuinely horrified to learn had always been payable. Dal Sarin came to the rim of the basin. His membrane had gone a color I never saw on him again and have never been able to name, something past gray, the color of a man recalculating not 3 centuries but the meaning of 3 centuries. He looked at the frozen number, the one we had spent in the first afternoon, and he looked at the other number, and he looked at me, and he did the thing I respect him for more than anything else any of them did. He did not look away from the cost. He made himself read it. You lost the near worlds, he said, in the first hours. You gave up more in 1 afternoon than the college has lost in 4 centuries of holding. Yes, I said. And then you won. Yes. His membrane moved slowly through the whole register of it. It was always there, he said, and it was not a question, and I understood he was not really speaking to me. The condition was always there. We wrote it. We have read it to every cohort for 300 years. He stopped. We told them it could not be won. It could be won, I said. You just weren't willing to pay for it. I kept my voice flat because it was not a thing to say with any heat and because it was not an accusation. It was only the arithmetic. That's not a failure. You're long. You've got the time to carry it, so carrying it is the smarter move for you. It would have been the smarter move for us too if we lived as long as you do. I looked at the number we had spent. We don't. So when something can't be won, the only question we know how to ask is what it would cost to win it anyway. And then sometimes we pay it. It isn't wisdom. It's just that we're not going to be here for the long carry. Above us, Eric's had not said a word. I think about Eric's more than any of them, honestly. Eric's had built the whole trap, had argued us into our seats, and then, in the moment of the ruined morning, argued us onto the table, entirely out of a certainty about what humans were. Rash. Unable to grasp consequence. Eric's had been completely right about the rash part, and completely wrong about everything that mattered, which is the most dangerous way a clever person can be wrong, and Eric's had just watched it happen in front of the entire council. The one thing the petition had been written to prevent. The council had not gone home with a reinforced wall. The council had not gone home with a confirmed contempt. The council was going home knowing that the deadlock they had built their governance on was a deadlock by choice, and that somewhere across the real frontier there might be a door with a price on it, and that the only reason the price had never been paid was that no one in 600 years of patient endurance had been short enough to ask. That is a heavy thing to carry home. I did not envy them it. Senorati, the oldest of the high seats, the one who had said they will not bear it, came down to the rim before we left. She moved very slowly even for a Solvani, and her membrane was nearly clear, and she stood for a long time looking at the frozen count over the basin, the billions of the first afternoon. You watched it the whole time, she said. The cost, you did not look away from it. No, I said. Most who spend a thing that large cannot look at it. They have to make it abstract or they cannot do it. Her membrane moved faintly. You looked at it, and you spent it anyway. It was the only way the door opened, I said. Seemed like the least I could do to watch it cost what it cost. She was quiet a moment. Then she said the thing I carried home myself, the thing I have never quite put down. We told ourselves it could not be won so that we would not have to look at the price of winning it. For 300 years that was kinder. You have made it so that we can never tell ourselves that again. She did not say it as a thank you, and it was not one, and I did not pretend it was. It was just true. The college scored us in the end, because the college scores everything. It is honest to the point of self-harm. There was no category for what we had done, because the scoring assumed the war could not be won and measured only how long you carried it. So a junior of the college had to be sent to find the original framers' notes, and the original framers, 3 centuries dead, had been honest too, and had written down what a resolved standing war should be scored, never expecting anyone to read it. So they scored us by the dead framers' rule, and the number does not matter, and I have forgotten it. What I remember is walking back up past the brass rail, past the rail we had been told not to cross, with the false galaxy stilled behind us, and 11 high seats sitting in a silence that had nothing to do with us anymore and everything to do with what they had to decide now, about their own frontier, about their own door, about the price they had spent 600 years agreeing not to look at. At the top of the steps, a junior of the college, very young by their standards, which is to say perhaps 80, stopped me. The membrane along the throat was moving fast, for a Solvani, fast enough that I knew the question had been building since the 4th hour. Master Carver, the junior said, getting the human honorific not quite right. How long did you know that it could be won? How long did you carry it before you played? And there it was, the only question that mattered to them, the one their whole civilization was built around. How long did you carry it? To a Solvani, the worth of a thing is the duration you bore it. They could not imagine that the answer was anything but a long, dignified span. I didn't carry it, I said. I read the footnote on the 2nd day. Then I waited 10 days for someone to let me touch the table. The membrane went very still. You carry things, I said. We finish them, it isn't better. It's just shorter. I went up the last of the steps, and Diaz and Okonkwo and Marsh and Ruiz and Hale came up behind me, 6 short-lived creatures who had walked into the corner of a room to watch and had been handed the table by a clever enemy's certainty. And we left them there with their stilled galaxy and their open door and their long, long time in which to decide what to do about it. They never put us near the long table again. Eric saw to that, I imagine, though I never asked. It did not matter. We had not gone there to win their war for them. We had gone there to sit at the back and not embarrass anyone, and we had failed at that completely in 5 hours in front of the whole council, and I have never once been sorry. The standing war cannot be won, Dalsarin told me, the way it had been told to every cohort for 300 years. He was a good man and an honest one, and he had carried the line longer than I will be alive, and he was wrong. And the difference between us was never courage and never wisdom. It was only that he had time and I did not, and so when they showed me a war that could not be won, I read the rules to the end and I found the price, and I paid it before the clock could finish the morning.